All right. So in this class, we're going to
The same thing
be
happens every time, where there's people sitting in the
learning
waiting
how to
room
set up the
and they're
first
like
class
me, but
for
prettier and better
the
at
look
the
dev on
because
our
maybe I'm
character.
not good enough.
In our previous class, we learned how to set
The
up the
same
look
thing
dev
happens every time, where there's people
for the
sitting in the
environment.
wait. The same
Uh,
thing happens.
so we,
Same thing happens every time, where there's
when in
people sitting in the
Photoshop, we
waiting
set up a
room
file that has
and they're
brushstrokes,
like me, but
and
prettier
each
and
layer has
better
a
at the
separate
because
set
maybe
of
I'm not good
strokes.
enough.
So we can easily repurpose them
The same thing happens every time, where
and
there's
change their
people sitting
value
in the waiting
depending on
room
what we're trying to do.
and they're like
And
me,
we're
but
going to
prettier
piggyback
and
on the
better at
same
the
setup
because maybe I'm not good.
to block in our character LookDev. Um, so if we go through the class real quick, we can see that this is our starting point. We're going to set up a subdivision scheme on the character so that we can remove the faceted look that we get on the Alembic file by default. And on the hair, we're going to actually set up number of iterations to 2 because the hair is particularly faceted. And then this is the file that we worked on for the character. You can see it has a very similar logic to what we had for the environment, where we have these brushstrokes. If I control click on each layer, you can see that they each have an alpha. And by having them in separate layers, it makes it very easy for us to set up alternative maps, where we might decide that these strokes are, you know, brighter, so they have a more roughness, or others are darker. So we can essentially repurpose them for many different reasons. For example, this would be normal maps, which we're not showing how to use just yet, but this setup of having the strokes in their own layer is very useful to quickly set up the surfacing for um, an asset. Okay, so let's go back to the class. So this is our starting point, right? And in the previous class, we pretty much used triclinear projections to texture everything, so we wouldn't have to worry about UVs. Now, this method is pretty powerful, but it limits how far we can push the look there because we cannot get specific with where we want the dirt to be. Everything is sort of procedural, we could say. We don't get to really direct every part of it. But for this character, we're gonna want to eventually get to the place where everything is applied through the UVs, so we can actually paint maps that get very specific. And we're not gonna show that in this class, but that's what the next class will cover. This class is all about getting the overall materials to a good place where when you look at the image and you squint, it looks like the final image. It might be missing some gradients, some details, some um, art direction, but the goal is to understand how to get the image in the ballpark and not get lost in the details. Because that's something that I often see artists do when they first try to complete a project. They get lost in details, and they, you know, a month or 2 months in, whole half of their image might still be great because they haven't gone through and assigned a shader to everything that sort of looks like the final thing. So rather than trying to treat this process as a linear process where everything has to be perfect, the goal of the class is to get us used to working separate passes. So you have a first pass, so when you squint, it looks pretty much what you're looking for. You need a second pass, the polishing. So at any point, someone could say, "Hey, that's it. There's no more time," and then you take your hands off, and you have a final image. As opposed to take your hands off and half of your image is you haven't even touched because you haven't gotten there yet, right? That's a big takeaway from this class. So here we are learning to set up material with UVs rather than projections, and you can see that there's some stretching in those UVs. So in the next class I'll actually show how to use something called a wrap deformer, so that you can create your own geometry with proper UVs and then use the current geometry to drive it. So we only use the original animated geometry as a driver for our own new geo that has all the detail we want, all the textures we want, the UVs we want. So we keep them separate. So we don't have to carry a lot of history in our model, which tends to create a lot of trouble. Um, but I'll show that in the next class. This class is pretty straightforward. So here we show how to um, set up essentially a skin shader with subsurface scattering. Um, and we essentially use AI color correct node to color correct the base color texture. And then we learn how to use the radius and the scale together so that we can control how far the light travels into the character. So this is the scale of the subsurface scattering effect, essentially. And you can see that we end up in a place where um, some of the light scatters through the small details like the hair or the fingers. Um, and then we move on to set up a roughness map and a bump map. We also go over the importance of setting the color space right. So for anything that we see, like a base color, um, we want to set the color space to sRGB. And for anything that is meant to be describing the quality of something, so exact values, we won't use raw. So, roughness, bump, all of those maps that describe the precise value of something, they'll need to stay raw. Um, So here we learn how to set up the radius, and the radius is something a little unique that might differ between different render engines, but for Arnold, the radius acts as a multiplier of the scale per channel, meaning that if you set the radius to white, it pretty much does nothing. The scale will be directly what ends up defining the look of the backscatter. But if you tint it, it will let the light travel further. For example, if you tint it red, the red channel. Um, so you can use a combination of a color and a grayscale to define areas where you want the light to travel overall further into the character, but you can also tint it. So it's a little confusing how you can do both, but in the class we go over the setup. And in the next class, we are actually going to paint specific maps so that, for example, if we keep scrolling, you can see that area here around the wrist is appears to have a light leak. So for certain areas where we want it to appear as though there's bone underneath, we want to essentially light to travel a little less uh, deep into the geo. We're gonna paint them up for that. So once we have this one shader in a good place, we just duplicate it. And then we set up two color correct nodes on the base color and on the subsurface color and radius. So essentially we try to reuse the same texture for everything. Uh, and this is just a very quick way to quickly apply a material to everything. And you can see we're using a color correction where we desaturate the original texture and we tint it with our own color so that we can essentially very quickly go from a place where we have just one shader to a place where we quickly assign overall good color to everything. Um, and then once we get into a good place, I actually bring everything into Photoshop and I do a quick paint over for myself to define where I want the image to go. And then I jump back into Maya and I make those changes. Um, Also, we learn how to set up metallic material. We go over a little bit what happens when you set the metallic to one, which essentially turns off all of the diffuse information and the subsurface, because metallic materials rely entirely on reflections, which is the glossy mode. Um, and this is what we cover in the class. So essentially, we go from uh, a character that's just gray with not a not well defined set of material properties to something that if you squint, it could look like a final image, right? if we look at these guys and then we jump to the
The same thing happens every time.
video, it's they're very similar.
The same thing happens every
Um,
time. Where there's people
they're
sitting in
not
the waiting room
specific yet.
and
So,
they're
for
and
example, we
they're
don't have,
like
we haven't done anything for the eyes. We haven't painted specific maps for the lips or the color of the cheeks or the roughness variation or the roughness. We are planning to add glitter, geometry that is wrap the form to the shirt or add some like indication that this is a shirt. Uh, all of those things will be very specific things that we're gonna get into the next class. This class is all about getting things in the ballpark so that um, we have an overall value and color for everything that is roughly where it needs to be. And this should be something that we get used to doing. Um, we want to try and tackle the areas that have the biggest screen space first. So if something is really big on the screen, we want to tackle that first. And we want to try to avoid having small elements pinning us down and taking up a lot of our time. So we want to be very efficient with our time. And this is one of the workflows that I suggest. We do a first pass on something, and then once that's done, we can move on to the details. All right. So I hope you enjoyed this overview of the class. Um, and um, and I'll see you in the next class then. All right. Thank you.